Things are going to start happening to me now.
You've done all the reading. You're a scholar. You're a professor. You've done all the reading. You've done the intellectual heavy lifting.
More or less, eat shit and die.
You wouldn't know a fact if it begged you all night long.
Want to give the wrong impression, because I am very high.
Ran up behind him with a hatchet. Smash, smash, smash.
Yeah. Care. I'm a libertarian. What I'm getting is,
Did you vote for Joe Jorgensen or Trump?
Who?
Joe Jorgensen. That was the perfect answer. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody, to the Libertarian Podcast Review. Tom Woods Week continues. We are stripping the 3x5 card of allowable opinion. That's what Tom says. That's not what I say. Welcome, everybody. This is Tyler Yonke. What is it, day 4 or so of Tom Woods Week? We've blown through over 900 episodes. We did an intro to Tom. We're going to keep doing this, people. We're going to get through it all, okay? Today, we're starting with episodes around 921 up to 1380, perhaps. Maybe that's part of tomorrow's. I mean, the way I had to do this originally, I'm recording it, and I'm stripping out these. I'm going to do it in 5 days. And day 1 was 2 hours. Day 2 was 2 hours. Couldn't do that, so we've broken them up. So when you're checking them out, you see day 1, it's 1 hour. Day 2 is an hour, and we're gonna do it maybe 7 days. So I hope you've enjoyed it. If you haven't, you go back there, find some of those. I might be. It'd be interesting to know if Tom or me actually knows more about his show at this point. Fantastic. I've listened. I've got all the clips. We're gonna keep rolling through here. And what is something that you can take from this is a plethora of stuff. And what's fascinating is to go through this, starting back when he was doing this, 2014, 15, 16. And then we're moving our way up through. And next thing you know, we're into COVID. And then to hear Tom with the COVID stuff, and that will be coming up. So pretty fantastic stuff. I hope everybody's doing fine. If you just found this show, like us, subscribe. We're on multiple platforms. Rumble, when we stream to Rumble, we seem to get our best viewership. So on Rumble, all you do there is go LPR, just 3 letters, 1 word, and Libertarian Podcast Review comes up. Subscribe to us there. Subscribe to us over on YouTube. We're on Twitter under Tyler Yonke, TYLERJANKE. Odyssey, we have a spot there. Locals as well, Libertarian Podcast Review, and all those places. Where are you going to find us if you want to have, I don't know, some of our members only stuff, which we do. We stream those live to Odyssey. That's the one place. It's the lowest tiers we have available. Then the next week, I stream them out to Spotify for your audio, or you can watch those as well. It's 99 cents a month if you want to do that. Once again, as low as we can go. And then the next week, about 2 weeks after, when we do the membership stuff, I post those to our Substack. So look us over there, Tyler Yonke at substack.com. And those are for free. You just have to join in as a member. So that's how the membership thing works. You could also join us over on Locals. I post those things over there as well. And that's kind of the thing. What do we do with the Locals? Not much. We're trying to help that out. The Substack, though, we post all our podcasts over there. So that's maybe the place to go. I also do some law stuff over there. So if you want to check that out. Tyler, enough. That's the 3x5 card of Tyler's available opinion. Let's get to the Tom Woods, and we'll quickly go right here. Tom has a lot to say. We're going to start off with this one, episode 938, Law Without the State, featuring the one and only Bob Murphy. And hang on, make sure I get okay. So it's always a danger doing all this stuff. So we will.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Hang on. Okay, Tom, we're getting ready to go. This is private law stupid. That's the premise, the setup we have here. Let's go to this. What do we think there? There you go. How about that? Ready, go.
Go ahead. Now you can answer my question. Okay. So I think the first thing to say is, let me try to rephrase it, or just to spin it and put it back on the accuser, is that most people, certainly most listeners of the Tom Woods Show, would agree that it would be crazy to let the state be in charge of producing cars, right? That what would happen? Well, if we just had a monopolist in charge of producing cars, quality would go way down, price would go way up, at least relative to the quality you were getting, and they would manipulate it for political purposes, right? Somebody wasn't towing the government line. They just would, oh, no car for you. Sorry, we're backlogged this year. All right, so there would be all sorts of reasons that you wouldn't trust politicians to be in charge of something as important as your car. And yet what we do trust them with is whether or not they can throw you in a cage, whether or not you're convicted of a crime, whether, if someone's breaking into your house, that's the thing. So, oh yeah, we'll let that sort of activity be left to the provision of the political system. But when it comes to things like food and shelter and transportation and video games and everything, pizzas, you wouldn't want the government in charge of pizzas. They'd screw that all up. But when it comes to protecting you from rapists and bank robbers and murderers, then that's the kind of thing we reserve for government provision, when we know in any of those other areas it would be horrible relative to the market. So I think most people realize, yes, there's a huge burden of proof on the interventionist, the one who thinks that this is the one area that for some reason can be handled adequately by the political process.
Okay, Chris Christie would disagree with that as far as what he says about pizza. I'm an attorney, and people are always like, law. No, we can't have private law. We already do. I can't tell you how many times I do family law. We could get a private judge, and as long as you consent that this is what it's like arbitration. I used to do arbitration, preparing for litigation for arbitration, and both of those with a brokerage firm. So anyway, that's exactly, we do have that, and it's not out of the realm. And I love that little premise of you taking it to all these other aspects that you could not imagine that the state would be involved in. Anyway, so that's where we have it there. Okay, let's go to the next one here. This is with this is episode 938. Once again, law without the state. Bob Murphy talks about chaos theory evolution. What do judges provide?
So I think the basic framework.
And by the way, Bob Murphy just talks, so sometimes it's hard to stop the clips or to get a good breaking segment
here. And this, by the way, for those who are familiar with my booklet, Chaos Theory, my thinking has evolved since then. So I think the starting point when it comes to, you say, well, how would a private legal system work, is just to ask, what function is it that judges are supposed to provide, or the law itself, that's not something that a bunch of experts just promulgates de novo, right? Just out of thin air. That you had societies, there was law, people understood what we now call property rights, legal customs or conventions, well before humans thought they had the ability or the privilege or the permission to just start legislating. Okay, so for a long time people knew, oh yeah, murder's wrong, and they generally respected it. If society didn't respect it, it would have disappeared. And so what I think the basic starting point is, when you try to figure out how could a legal system work without this one group arrogating it to itself the power to say, no, we're the ultimate authority here, is just to say people still would have this idea of property rights. There would be a general framework of understanding to say, okay, yes, it is immoral. It is a crime. It's not just immoral, but it is a crime to walk up to somebody and stab them in the face for no reason. That you can't do that. You just broke the law. I don't think we need to say, oh, how would anybody know that? People do know that, and they wouldn't know that here. And that's the starting point. People have this shared framework, and then what judges would do is render their private opinion when it comes to disputes that can't be handled just between the parties in question. So just like with arbitration right now, so that this isn't purely science fiction, we have models of this right now. We see it in operation all over the place, that if a couple's getting divorced, they probably don't go through the regular court system unless they really, one of them is being completely obstinate. Both parties agree, even though we have this dispute, we might hate each other's guts, and one party might not even like what's happening. Nonetheless, they might go through arbitration because it's just so much more efficient. And so how does that market work? Well, because both parties can agree we need to have some third party to give us a ruling or an opinion on this matter. And that's how they go through. So just like right now, you have people like if a worker starts with the firm and they might have a contract, and they might say, we agree to settle this through arbitration. So how do private arbitrators stay in business? They have to have a reputation for fairness. So the big thing here is, the starting point to me is that people would already have basic primitive notions as to what the law is. And they would know basic things, like somebody builds a house in the middle of a forest, that's that person's house. You wouldn't say, oh no, some guy who had nothing to do with that can just stroll in, and the community would say, well, geez, I don't know, maybe it's his house. There would be basic intuitions like that. And the role of private judges would be, in cases where there was genuine conflict, the two parties would submit their case to the judge and say, we want to get your opinion. So even in our statist society, the terminology, what does the judge do? The judge writes an opinion. And so that really, I think, is the key here. It's not that the judges are making law. What they do is they say, here's what the law is, in my opinion, and how it applies to this particular case. And that's what judges do, is they apply the law to particular cases, and they're experts in it. They have expertise in certain areas of the law. So all of that follows through in a private legal system. The main difference at this level, and I'll stop here and let you push back, Tom. The main difference is there's no monopoly. You can't compel people to be in your jurisdiction. So right now in the state monopolistic framework, if there's a case that goes before a state-appointed judge, it's not that both parties have to agree as to which judge is going to hear the case. That's sort of just assigned. And so if the judge is corrupt or incompetent, makes a string of horrendous rulings that the public is outraged by, it's, maybe if the judge is up for election or something, that will come up later. But it's not like a private system where the judge who rules on labor contract disputes has a history, his expertise in that.
There you go. I mean, that's what are you going to say? I think that's pretty spot on. The next one, how do you resolve this classic case? Once again, Bob Murphy sharing his info about private courts and private law. Here we go.
You believe that I stole your I'm not going to say TV because we're not going to date ourselves. TVs are on the way out. So let's say I stole your iPad, and you're pretty sure I stole it. And so then what happens? I mean, do you need my consent to drag me before a judge? And if not, what gives you the right to drag me before a judge? Just what, because you think I have an iPad? Where'd you get the right to do that?
Okay, great. So I think the general way this would happen is I would think, oh yeah, Wood stole my iPad. And so I would challenge you, and then you'd say, no, I didn't. What are you talking about? Get out of here. This is mine. And so then I would not at this point be able to just go up to I'm not sure what these agencies, let's call a repo man or something, that kind of an agency where they have burly men who wear flak jackets and have other sorts of, methods of persuasion, who have things where they can knock down doors and so on. At this point, I would not yet be able to go to one of those companies. And if I did and said, yeah, Woods has my iPad, they would say, well, you need legal proof, right? Because otherwise the community might think we're just a bunch of thieves if we go break down his door and take the iPad back and give it to you on your say-so. You need to have the legal system agree with you. We need a legal opinion. And so then I said, all right. And so I go to you and I said, look, here's a list. I just went to Google, looked up a list of 10 judges in our area who all specialize in petty property theft or whatever the actual term would be to handle what our case was. And here, I'm willing to submit our case to any one of them. I have the receipt from Best Buy that I bought that iPad. You conveniently scratched off the serial number, so that's not going to look very good. It'll be clear that was mine. I can show some other documentation. You, I'm presuming, have no ability to demonstrate that you bought this through a legitimate way. And and I can go through and get whatever my case is. And I'm happy to go to any of these 10 judges in our area that this website that rates judges and stuff on their reputation says I'll get 5 stars. What have you? What say you? And then either you agree to it or not. But if you don't agree to it, then I think I'll go to one of those judges and you'll be tried. What's the term? In absentia, where you don't show up, and presumably you're the judge, assuming I have some compelling evidence, the judge is going to make a ruling. And so then if I have that kind of a thing, I'll go to the Burly Men agency and they may go retrieve my iPad.
And we have that now. I mean, default judgments happen constantly, all the time. So if someone doesn't want to show up into court, I mean, look, is this a pie in the sky? Maybe, but we have a lot of this stuff already. So I think the important part, and one of the guys I was talking to about this, I don't know if it's still Bishop, maybe. Yeah, I think it was, where I'm like, okay, I get where maybe you're on the paleo side and maybe you don't feel, you don't want to talk about this theory stuff anymore. Okay, I understand that. But with that in mind, it doesn't help changing the Overton window. So you start to talk to people about this private stuff before, they first hear it. That's like the pushback, especially, I have a right-wing family, and it cracks me up when I talk about private stuff, and then they're like, whoa. And you're like, but you're involved. You want the free market to work with everything, and suddenly you're getting pushback because you've never heard this. So the more you hear it, the more you start to understand. Oh yeah, no, that's common sense. I get it, and you have to wash yourself out from this. So anyway, that's one aspect that I think it's important to have this understanding, to keep this in mind, because this isn't Capistan in a sense, because private law, I think it more than anything can happen. And it does. That's my point. It happens all the time. We are involved with it quite a lot already. Okay, this next one, Tom worries about honor killings. By the way, it was the most classic case. I thought it was going to be buggery, but it wasn't. Anyway. No?
There are cultures that approve of honor killings. This young woman has brought dishonor on our family because she married some man without our approval, and therefore we can murder her. How do you integrate that? So, in other words, you're saying that, Okay, we can't integrate that into a Rothbardian society. Okay, but those people live there, and those people have those beliefs. And unless you have a state that's going to smack them down and say, look, in this jurisdiction, you don't act that way, and you can't just go appeal to some other court that's going to say that it's okay. No, you are out of here. You are not going to live in our society. How does it operate how does this work in what you're describing?
Okay, let's frame, though, the issue. Right now, you admit that on planet Earth there are honor killings. That's why you're worried about this, because it's a real thing, right?
Yeah.
Now, does that just happen in Somalia right now?
It happens in a bunch of places with governments, if that's what you mean.
Yes, that's what I'm getting at. So it's certainly not the case that, oh, wait a minute, because there might be human beings who really strongly believe in the legitimacy of honor killings, therefore we clearly need a state, because otherwise these killings might occur. That's obviously a non sequitur. These killings occur right now, primarily, I would think, in regions that are dominated by states that claim to have a monopoly on the legal and police power. So that's certainly not solving the problem by saying, no, let's let the population support a monopoly.
Okay, that's the malice type of thing of like, okay, now you're just arguing for what's already in place or against it or what have you. So, yeah, I get it. Okay, let's go to the last one here. But the rich will be even more advantaged. Will they? I don't know. Perhaps.
Off track. Why wouldn't the rich guy simply win every time? Why couldn't he bend justice to his advantage?
Okay, so you're right. You did raise two objections there. So the second one that you went into, I think, is actually pretty strong. So if someone just says in general, what we have now seems to be okay, especially, in the wealthy countries, and why don't we just try to tinker or, work for improvements on the margin here instead of, whoa, but, we don't want to go down the French Revolutionary path. I actually agree with that largely. So, what am I doing? I write essays and books, and I'm just trying to convince people, let's imagine this world first. Okay, now how would we get there? So I'm actually being pretty pragmatic and step by step and nothing crazy in that sense, right? I'm just first saying, let's think about the society and how would it work, and then how do we apply this now in our own lives, and step by step. Maybe I'm not going to go vote for one of the two candidates next time. Okay, so that's not a real crazy radical implication in terms of my behavior day to day, switching just because now I've had this philosophical insight, this change in perspective. Okay, so I actually am okay with you saying that, but if you're now saying, and in particular, the types of thing I'm worried about, Murphy, is in your framework, wouldn't the judges get paid off by rich guys, and wouldn't it be better to have a monopoly state? I would say no, that's not a good argument, because again, all the reasons for why it might happen, there might be corruption under decentralized judicial rulings where both parties have to consent before they bring the case before the judge. Clearly, you're going to have much less corruption in that kind of a framework than under the current system. And so when you look at the current system and say, yeah, I'm sure there are judges on the take, and I'm sure like when the Supreme Court rules in cases involving the federal government versus someone who objects to it, I'm thinking maybe the Supreme Court sides with the federal government since it's part of the federal government. If you're okay with this system and think, yeah, that's not so bad, well, then I think what would happen under genuine decentralization and competition among judges would be amazing to you.
And I'll just point out there. So I don't do criminal law anymore, and the judge and only just to say who's getting paid by whom, and maybe that makes a difference. The judge gets paid by the state, the DA gets paid by the state, the police officers get paid by the state. A lot of the forensic that goes along there, they're paid by the state. And also the public defenders are paid by the state. So where I understand you're altruistic and you're but where's your funding coming from? If you're just going to say who's getting paid off, remember that. Plus the rich people you're talking about, that kind of stuff. I go back to the O.J. Simpson trial and the city of Los Angeles. I think they outspent him 3-1, something like that. So he put $6 million. They put a bunch more in there. So, if he didn't have that money, what would easy there, Tom? Slow down, slow your roll. What would have happened if they didn't have that? So anyway, that's just one of there. Okay, now we're gonna keep moving on. This is Brian McClanahan comes on. He talks about episode 942, Alexander Hamilton, worse than you thought. The Hidden History with Brian McClanahan. He does great work that comes on Tom's show. Also, I love his podcast. Remember, Tom Woods then does a debate with Michael Malice at some point, and we'll play some of that here. But I thought this would be kind of a run-up to it because it's in a seminal part of Tom Woods' show. His whole thing with Michael Malice and being one of the top guests in his show. And so here you go. McClanahan talking about.
Oh no, that's actually why I wanted to write it at this time. I mean, I looked at that and said, you go into a Barnes and Noble. It's not just that. You go into a Barnes and Noble and they have like a Hamilton gift pack at the front store. You get your Hamilton, your Chernow Hamilton, your CD of the Hamilton musical. You get a T-shirt or a bumper sticker. I mean, it's absolutely nuts what's going on with Hamilton right now. It's crazy. I can't believe it.
Okay, that was just kind of like, hey, why are you talking about Hamilton right now? Why is it such a big deal? Well, because of the Miranda, what's his name? Lin Miranda, the Hamilton musical. Okay, the next one, just throwing you some of these things here. Assumption.
Okay, well, assumption is the idea that, of course, if you look in the Constitution, Article 6 clearly talks about the new general government assuming the debts of the old general government, right, under the Articles of Confederation. So everyone knew that was going to happen. But the issue was the state debt. And how was the general government going to handle the state debt? So all the states had gone out and racked up debt during the American War for Independence. They had borrowed money just like the central authority had. And several of these states, namely Virginia, most importantly, had already paid off this debt. Massachusetts had not. And this is actually why you had Shays' Rebellion in 1787, because the state of Massachusetts had up their tax revenue or up their tax rates to a point where people couldn't pay it. And so you had all these farmers who said, look, we can't pay that tax. We're gonna have a tax revolt. And what's interesting about that, kind of an aside, people like Sam Adams said, well, these guys should be hung for that because, yeah, you can't say it's no taxation without representation because you're represented. During the war, we weren't represented, so we were opposing taxes, but now you got to pay them. And I think that was, overall how many people thought about taxes in the early republic. But getting aside from that, so the idea, we're going to assume the debts of the states. Now, Hamilton wanted to do it for a number of reasons. His ostensible, surface reasons were, look, this is going to build a line of credit. We need a good line of credit because that would ensure that our finances are secure. If we can prove that we'll pay people back, we'll have a strong economy. Also, it would be immoral not to pay back the Dutch or the French because, these guys helped us out. So we got to do that. But underneath all that, under the surface, Hamilton, I think, knew exactly what he was doing. He wanted to assume the debts of the states because that would render the states fairly impotent in this new general government. He was reducing them to corporations.
Hear that?
So Hamilton's plan in this case went before the Congress, and there were people that looked at it and said, well, wait a second here. You can't really do this. There's nothing in the Constitution that authorizes the general government to assume the debt of the states. And in fact, they were 100% right because Hamilton and Madison had actually had a conversation about this. And it's written like this. During a long walk in August, Hamilton and Madison went out and had a conversation about state debt, and they decided that they wouldn't even bring it up. They would deal with that later because if they brought it up at Philadelphia, it would be outright rejected. So here we go. We're in the new government now. We've got the Constitution ratified. Hamilton's now Secretary of the Treasury, which he thinks he's actually Prime Minister. He handles all departments of all divisions of government. But he proposes to assume the debts, and voila, he does exactly what Madison and Hamilton had decided in August 1787. But, of course, there's nothing in the Constitution, and some people bring this up. Wait a second, you can't do this. You can't assume the debts of the states. It's not written in there. Of course, it passes through, but there was some talk about how this is going to work. Because of the opposition, Hamilton was very worried that this would not go through. So one day, he's outside of his home and near Jefferson's home, and Jefferson sees him. And Jefferson had just gotten back from France, and he writes that he saw Hamilton was haggard looking, he was disheveled, he was just pacing. He was beside himself. And Jefferson knew exactly what was going on here because he was worried assumption wasn't going to go through. There was enough opposition they could block it. So Jefferson calls a dinner meeting. Look, why don't you come over? We'll invite Madison. We'll talk about this. And so they do that. And, of course, what we get out of that is the Washington, D.C. Compromise. Madison agrees to drop any opposition to assumption in return for the capital moving from New York and then later Philadelphia to a southern location, which became Washington, D.C. So Jefferson essentially and Madison did a great disservice to the Constitution. They accepted this implied power to assume debt in return for the capital. Of course, you reap what you sow because implied powers became the thing that Hamilton kept hammering then over and over again as he was Secretary of Treasury.
Fascinating. I didn't know all that stuff, or I've probably heard it at some point, but there you go. Phil Magnus, not Phil, Brian McClanahan. I mean, Phil knows this stuff too, except when it comes to Hoppe, he's out in the wind there. Okay. This next one is Agent 7. I didn't know about this. So a little conspiracy theory time for everybody. Ready, go. Brian.
Conversation with a guy named Beckwith. And Beckwith was a British agent, and he was introduced to Hamilton through his family. The Schuyler family is a married family in New York. And so Hamilton has a conversation with Beckwith, and Beckwith actually calls Hamilton Agent Number 7. I mean, you think about that. Hamilton is given a covert number, Agent Number 7, because the conversations they're having are the exact opposite of what both Washington and Jefferson wanted to happen in foreign policy. Because Hamilton tells Beckwith, you know what? I want us to be allies. I want the United States and the British to be buddies. I think that'd be the best interest of the United States. And, Madison's going to be against it, but we'll get around that because, the guy will come around. We'll persuade him this is the best thing to do for us. And so Hamilton carries on this very long correspondence with Beckwith over several months. And as the situation in Europe becomes very dangerous, you get the French Revolution at that point. and the United States could be dragged into a war with Great Britain because supposedly we're in a permanent alliance with France. Hamilton is still telling Beckwith, yeah, we want to be allies with the British. Don't worry. I know it sounds like Jefferson's on board with the French, but I want us to be on board with the British. And he actually lies. He never tells anybody about this. And at one point in a cabinet meeting, he kind of lets it out of the bag just a little bit that, well, maybe I've been talking to a British agent, but he doesn't actually devolve all the things that he's been doing. And so this is essentially treason. He's working against the official foreign policy of the United States. And eventually he accepts neutrality. And I know you want to talk about that, so I'll stop there. Eventually he accepts neutrality because he thinks that's in the best interest of alliance with the British and the United States as well. So I'll let you pick up on neutrality there and ask the question.
So he sounds like to me he's our presidents, Russiagate, Ukraine stuff. They're just being like the founding fathers. That's what they're really doing. Okay, Brian McClanahan has some great stuff here with presidents. But anyway, that one was really good. Let's go to episode number 958, the show that never ends: the rise and fall of progressive rock. Bonus episode with Dave Weigel. Or Weigel, I'm not sure. Look, rocking my Pink Floyd shirt. I do love all these progressive rock episodes with Tom Woods. We did a little thing earlier, the episode 1, day 1, with Jeff Toll. I just love a lot of the stuff he does there. So with that in mind, this one is, what is prog rock? And we're going to kind of start with that. Ready, go.
Before we go on, I guess we have to do the perfunctory. How would you define progressive rock? Because there are going to be people listening who are listening out of a spirit of goodwill, or because I badgered them into listening to this episode, and they don't know what on God's green earth we're even talking about.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's rock music that's ambitious and sucks in influences from all manner of music that is not rock. It is a bit more European and a bit less influenced by the blues, but it's stuff that builds on rock forms but includes classical music, Eastern music, experimental electronic music. I put it that way. And I keep a pretty narrow definition of what it is, but a pretty wide aperture for what bands can be included in it, because I just, copy's the wrong word. I took my cues from the way that this was covered in the 60s and 70s by the music industry, by music magazines, and they had a clear definition that was also really expansive. There were bands like Griffin that are basically playing Renaissance music, and there are bands like Soft Machine that are basically playing out of this world jazz fusion stuff with heavy keyboards, and both of them would be progressive rock, and Mike Oldfield smack in the middle of that. So it's a pretty all-encompassing definition. It's easier to think of it as in terms of what came around to destroy it, which was punk. Punk was supposed to be DIY and simple and uncomplicated, and progressive rock was very complicated.
Okay, so am I a fan of punk? Some of it, but I'm more of a new wave alternative type of person from the 80s. Okay, next one we're going here: the fall of prog rock. Critics being bought off, or was it the punk issue? What is it?
2 albums in a row that were all one song. The whole album is one song, so very limited radio play, yet they both hit #1 in America at all one song. And I asked Ian Anderson, what do you think changed? That would never happen today. What do you think changed? And I was kind of hoping he'd say people got stupider or something provocative, and I don't even remember his answer. What do you think happened?
He wouldn't say people got stupider. That's the answer some of these guys would use, especially Greg Lake, who I talked to before he died for the series for Slate and then for the book, blamed it both on kind of public taste moving, but that public taste being shaped by this really, what he calls a vinyl record industry that just decided to cut bait on experimental music and embrace punk, even though punk never actually sold very well. I do going through all my research did find kind of a market role in how this music declined. It was critics and the industry, in terms of these labels that had progressive bands, they really did cut back in 1977 while punk was rising in this dramatic way. The critics just on a dime flipped from being interested in what these bands were doing to disinterested. And I would notice that the readers were not off the train yet. In the end of year polls on what the best album, the best guitarist, the best keyboard player was, this progressive band still did very well. But it was pretty much driven by this critical community. And I think you can understand some of that. I mean, the music had been at that point in the high seat for 8-9 years, which is a pretty good amount of time for any kind of trend in music. But it did seem like there was an assassin you could put your finger on, and it was these critics and these record labels that just said, enough of this.
Interesting. And I think maybe we're getting away from some of that, the way you can push your own music out. You may not be that rock star that's going to be, making millions and millions of dollars, but, you can definitely bypass a lot of the stuff and get your music out there. And just like podcasts and other things. Okay. What will you find in this book by Dave Weigel?
When you were having a chance to interview all these great people, did you feel like the interviews were just confirming what you already knew, or was anything genuinely surprising?
Yeah, I tried to make sure that when I interviewed somebody, I was getting something new. It was, I'm trying to think of an example. So it was very clear whenever I emailed somebody or called their manager, look, I'm not just going to do a greatest hits interview or a, what are your influences, stuff like that. I only called people after I had read everything I could and watched all the interviews that existed that they'd put out already. And then I would go to them to fill in gaps. So I would go to Steve Hackett, for example, and say, don't need to talk that much about Genesis. You're on the record a lot about it. I want to talk about what you were doing in the period after you leave Genesis and the band is kind of blowing up. So we talked specifically about that when it came to Todd Rundgren. I only want to talk to you about a couple of years of Utopia and Initiation and the progressive rock experience, and then that's it. And let's go for like an hour on that. And so they were very specific interviews to fill in these knowledge gaps, and mostly fun. They weren't always fun. There were some occasions where I had to talk to somebody only as part of a promotional tour, and I kept trying to wrench it back to what I wanted that wouldn't always go there.
Oh, sure.
Okay, I'd just say check. I don't know, maybe check out the book, but if not, at least check out Tom Wood's interview here because they go over a lot of fantastic stuff you get to hear about with the Tom Woods bonus episode talking about prog rock. Okay, episode 969. Where do rights come from? This one I thought was. Tom does this every once in a while, kind of a solo episode or where he does a speech and he throws this in, and this one was mind-blowingly awesome. So look, it's one thing when I kind of bring some people on or talk to him, or actually I haven't really brought them on the podcast for this kind of stuff, but if, debating, where do rights come from? Put that out there initially. I do that in my own personal life when we're having kind of like political discussions. And if they don't really know, I had this one with this guy who's super smart, and I said that, and when he really breaks it down, he's like, oh, the government makes them. I'm like, well, then they can take them away. So those aren't really rights. And so Tom Woods breaks this down. He walks us through the whole sequence. And so we're going to go through some of these here, starting with what's this talk about? We'll get there, and then a definition of rights, and then some other things, including kind of the Hans Hermann Hoppe ending.
The topic for this episode today is the origin of rights. We talk about individual rights a lot, but where do they come from? What are they grounded in? Can they be defended? Are they just arbitrary? So what I do here is really a historical review of different rights theories that have existed over the years. And I wonder if today maybe I would do a better job, although I don't think you'll be super duper disappointed or anything, but I've learned a lot since then. But I think this is still a pretty good overview of rights theories going back from the Middle Ages up to the present. And what more could you ask from a podcast than that? So here we go, and I hope you enjoy it. So what we're going to do is talk.
So get into the talk. We're going to kind of, like I said, skip around. I want to go right to his definition of what are rights, and then we'll skip around a little bit.
So first, before we talk about rights, we got to define what the term means. What exactly is a right? There are a great many definitions of rights, but one that I like and that others in this sort of tradition like comes from a guy who's still alive, Father James Sadowski, who was a professor of business ethics at Fordham for many years, one of the few non-commie professors of business ethics, by the way. And Sadowski's definition is as follows. He says, when we say that one has the right to do certain things, we mean this and this only, that it would be immoral for another, alone or in combination, to stop him from doing this by the use of physical force or the threat thereof. Now notice he does not say, in fact, he goes on to clarify this. He says, we do not mean that any use a man makes of his property within the limits set forth is necessarily a moral use. So people may do something that's immoral and still, strictly speaking, be within their rights. So not every vice is or should be criminalized. So you can break promises, by and large. You can be a liar. You can be late all the time. But by and large, these aren't things we're going to throw you in jail for. I mean, strictly speaking, you have a natural right to be late, even if it's really annoying. So in other words, a right is, in effect, it's a sphere of action in which you can act and in which it would be morally wrong for anyone to interfere with you violently or with the threat of violence. Now, I think it's been taken for granted by many people that rights and rights language.
Okay, there we go for that. Okay, well, let's just keep moving our way along. The next one on where do rights come from? We are talking about Tom praises globalists. Interesting take, Tom.
Francisco de Vitoria is considered to be one of the founders of international law. Now, we hear international law and we think boo, hiss. But all he means by it is not a United Nations. All he means by it is simply that there is a single standard of justice that applies to all people. Now, this is not a common thing to come across in the world, this emphasis on there being a single standard of justice that applies to me and to my people just as much as it applies to you and your people. I mean, we don't have any record of Attila the Hun sitting back and saying, gosh, should I really be treating people this way, or should I maybe stop these conquests in the name of natural rights? You know, I mean, I mean, he was asked once, how come you're looting and pillaging and stealing stuff from people? And he said, well, I don't know, because I want to take people's stuff. Like, why are you even asking me the question? Or likewise, the Harvard historian Samuel Eliot Morrison points out that a number of the North American tribes, Indian tribes, they had the same word for the people as they had for members of our tribe, and the same word for enemy or son of the she-dog or whatever they would apply to members of other tribes. Now, if you're going to think in that way, you're never going to reach a level at which you can make a universal statement about universally applicable natural rights. So this is a rarity in the history of the world. So Francisco de Vitoria argues that the natives are rational, so they possess the distinguishing characteristic of human beings, and they are created in God's image, and therefore they are entitled to the same treatment we would accord to our fellow Europeans.
Okay, I don't know. I thought that was some sort of an interesting part. The best part, though, is when he starts to develop and go through he works his way through the natural rights stuff, Locke and all those people that kind of push those things, and then gets to Hans Hermann Hoppe and argumentation ethics and brings that into account. And I just think he does a great job. Now, I think Stefan Kinsella expands on it to a point. But anyway, Tom Woods here on HHH.
The recognition of the following things. And I've described these things as scarcity and its implications. We're living in a world of scarce resources in the sense that we do not have enough resources and resources would include labor power as well, for all of us simultaneously to pursue all the ends we may want to pursue. We are inevitably faced with scarcity. Because resources are scarce, they're not superabundant like air. Supposing we have clean air. Air is so superabundant, we don't argue about it. We don't allocate property rights to air in most cases. Because it's so superabundant, no one argues about it or cares. But most goods do not exist in superabundance. They're scarce. And because scarce resources exist, and because my exercise of a range of control over one thing precludes your simultaneous exercise of a range of control over that thing, the potential for conflict exists by virtue of the existence of scarcity. So if we want to live peacefully in society, given the possibility of conflict that scarcity introduces, we need a peaceful, objective, conflict-avoiding system of property ownership that would assign these scarce resources to some owner who can exercise a range of control over them. So peaceful, well, that's obvious. Again, if we're looking to avoid conflict, we need peace. But also objective. Whatever it is that links me with the good that I exercise control over needs to be something that can be recognized by everyone, that is objective. It can't just be, I've got a feeling that I should own such and such. Well, you might have the feeling that you should own it, and that doesn't avoid conflict at all. So it needs to be an objective link between the person and the object owned.
There you go. I think I like that scarcity part gives it an understanding, because rights, you can't say, oh, they're God-given rights, and then have an argument or a discussion with someone who doesn't believe in God. It doesn't really always work that well. Okay, so the next one we're going to look at here is a libertarian drama. Libertarian Party chairman takes swipe at your host. I do love it when Tom takes on the Nick Sarwarks and some of the libertarian types. He often does. He's like, I don't like to do this. And then he does, gets in the muck. And I sincerely appreciate that, partly because I would as well. So, and I do. I jump in there. I've defended Dave on many occasions on some of these things that these losers have put out forth. So this first one here, it's Unite the White. What? Yeah.
Inside baseball. But we've had a lot of white nationalist rallies that have come out. And
by the way, this was a conversation that he had with Jason Stapleton to talk about all of it. And this is when Jason was a little bit more into the libertarian stuff.
And inside of that, the Charlottesville one most...
And Jason actually had Nick on his show and kind of berated him and went after him, which was a good episode as well.
Prevalent. And inside of that, several people who call themselves or have called themselves libertarians who are now aligning themselves with the white power movement. Most notably, I think Chris Cantwell was someone who had been on your show several years ago. And you had someone who put up, and I don't even know who it was, who stuck up a page called Liberty Against Fascism, which I'm unclear why you would even need to say that, because it's a straight contradiction in terms just in the title. But there's a letter written saying we Liberty followers don't believe in fascism and we reject it, and you should sign this letter saying that you agree with it. And you and a couple other people decided that you were not going to sign this, and that created a wee bit of controversy with Nicholas Sarwark, who heads up the Libertarian Party. Can you talk to me a little bit about that and kind of explain to me in your own words what happened?
Sure. And by the way, I would say there are also plenty of people from the Liberty Movement who wound up in the Bernie Sanders camp. I'm sure you've come across this in social media. They used to be for Ron Paul. Now they're for Bernie. And you think, oh, yeah, well, how did we completely mess that up? That you somehow got what it. So the fact that people go off the rails is unfortunate, but it's not like that's never happened before. It's happened in all directions. But when it comes to this whole I have to get on the internet and tell everybody how much I'm against the Nazis thing, I don't go for that. You know, I mean, first they want to make clear that I'm against slavery. I mean, what possible courage does it take to be against slavery in 2017? These people who are so at pains to let everybody know how opposed to slavery they are in 2017, these are the last people in the world who would have been against it in 1857 when it really counted, because these are people who crave attention and they want to be on the right side. They want to have all the fashionable opinions. Well, being anti-slavery was very unfashionable in those days, even in the North. So to that. But then fascism. So my view is.
Okay, and I used that example the other day when I was talking to Andy about something about, you know, it's so obvious you don't have to actually present a defense. Because if you're going to start defending everything, then you've got to defend everything, right? You have to put a statement out about everything. So that's it. Although I did hear, I'm trying to remember what it was. Tom had a show, and I don't remember the topic because I almost like did a comparison where he's like coming out kind of like, hey, they need to disclose, they need to stand up against this thing. So, you know, there's give and take on all these kind of things, but Nazi is pretty extreme. So the next part was Nick sucks balls out of context. Okay.
Appreciate you saying that. And I need to emphasize that this is not just a matter of he's ribbing me a little bit for not signing a petition. This is outright character assassination. It's out of context. It's quotations from 5 years ago that he kind of implies were said today in completely different context. I mean, it's tactics that I myself would never use, even against my worst enemy. I would never do any of these things to anyone.
Hang on. I want to clarify because you're talking specifically about the Cantwell interview you did in 2014, correct? Right. Yeah. So,
by the way, Cantwell's just back on Twitter this last week.
For everybody who's listening, Tom, I listened to the episode. Tom did an interview with Chris Cantwell back in 2014. Tom did what he always does, which is to find common ground. And what they did was they pulled some quotes from that interview from 2014 and made it appear as though it was an interview that he had just given.
Like last week.
And so,
right.
Yeah, absolutely. It was absolutely despicable.
It was unbelievable. Because if I can just jump in, we were talking about, you know, libertarian infighting, very inside baseball stuff, but sometimes that's fun for me and it's a guilty pleasure. And he had written a few pretty good articles. I mean, there's no denying they were pretty good articles. And so I said, because I really don't feel like launching civil wars against a million people. So I said, look, I'm glad you're doing this because I don't want to have to do it, but I'm glad you're out there doing it and I appreciate the work you're doing. Now, obviously, what I mean is I'm glad you wrote that article against this person, this person, and this person, because I sure don't want to have to. Well, then they just float that around to make it sound like I said it this year, to make it sound like I'm saying, well, I'm glad you're a racist anti-Semite because I sure can't do that publicly. But that is evil. There is no getting around. That is just evil. There's no possible excuse for that. He knows what he's doing. He knows that's fake. I mean, he doesn't have an IQ of 53.
Well, I don't know. And by the way, I would never take Tom out of context.
And it just makes me wonder, you're dead, bitch. You know, why are you doing this to this poor guy?
Okay. I mean, I think that's that's proof right there. Okay, so that was a good one. If you want to look, this is what you get with Tom, and I'm just filling you in on some of these things. You get the drama that he's been through, his defense, and you get the context. And I think that's the biggest thing, is to show context with all this. This is what I love about clips, and I play maybe a little bit too much of those, is to always show the context that we're talking about here with everybody involved. Because I really believe you can take on these people's arguments for the most part without having to take them out of context. I mean, there's Steven Crowder, as an example, some of the stuff I've shown with him, you don't have to take it out of context. He just says it and says it. So it's pretty easy. This next one is James Demore, formerly of Google, on diversity of thought, episode 1014. Who? James Demore? Who?
My other ones, I promise you, will be a surprise. So let's at least start there.
Yeah, so my document was talking about Google's ideological echo chamber. So how only progressive beliefs were allowed, basically, at Google. And there was a politically correct monoculture that dissented or shamed dissenting views. And this was silencing any other perspective on our diversity efforts. And so the prevailing perspective at Google is that the only cause for the gender gap is sexism against women. And so in the document, I provided other explanations that could contribute to the gender gap, like women's differing interests in people versus things, and how this is actually linked to biology, specifically prenatal testosterone. So it's not all just socially constructed differences between men and women. And then I go on to make some suggestions on how we could actually address the gender gap in tech without resorting to just discriminating against people and making programs that are only for specific genders or races. And they felt like this document perpetuated gender stereotypes, and so they fired me, even though everything that I said was accurate. So it's really unfortunate that they're just blinding themselves to this.
Okay, and if you don't remember James Demore, it was hit the news. It was a big deal. It seems like a long time ago, and everything's gotten any better. I mean, at Twitter maybe, but I don't know if anywhere else. This one, who are James's influential thinkers?
What would you say are people who have influenced the way you look at the world?
Yeah, so I guess I would characterize at least my leanings as libertarian, although I definitely see a role for government in maybe even more places than the average libertarian. So I guess on these issues, I think Jordan Peterson and Steven Pinker have produced some influential content on this. And I guess in general, there's a lot of people that I listen to that have influenced my thinking. Like I like Sam Harris's podcast and Russ Roberts' Econ Talk.
Oh,
those are both really nice.
It is interesting to see how Sam Harris has kind of gone from that's who we were kind of doing listening to. I mean, I would at some point too. I would be like, okay, he's in the intellectual dark web and all that stuff, and now he's just a rabid piece of shit. But that happens. Libertarian Silicon Valley.
You're a busy guy. You're doing real work. But did you sense when you were at Google that there was any kind of, at least among a minority of people there, underlying sympathy for libertarianism? I mean, that generous reception that Ron Paul got couldn't have come from nowhere.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely libertarian elements in Silicon Valley, and I feel like that's what created a lot of the companies. But I think there's sort of been a progressive move, especially with these diversity programs, that has sought to silence some of the libertarian ideals. And so there's still a decent number of libertarians, but they just don't feel like they can speak. And then anyone that's socially conservative really doesn't think that they can speak at all.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Interesting. So last one, we'll take here a clip of him, and we're flying through some of these because it was an interesting thing to look back on. I didn't know that he necessarily said so much other than, it's take some stuff from what he's saying, project it to where we're at now, and you get a few little things. So this last one, government surveillance and getting along to work. And by the way, a lot of this was interesting after now when Twitter files have
government surveillance practices, or the government use of, or let's say demanding information from supposedly private firms in order to assist in its data gathering.
It's definitely scary. And I think people often don't realize that this is happening, where the government is demanding information on something like 40,000 people a year, and Google is giving it to them. Right? They're abiding by the law, so maybe we need to just change the law.
Yeah, exactly. What kind of advice would you give people then? It basically is the advice that if you have unorthodox views, either be quiet about them or make sure that you're in one of these smaller firms, as you mentioned, where they're not going to be as ideologically rigid?
Yeah, that would definitely help. And within Silicon Valley, there are social groups that cater towards these differing viewpoints. But it's definitely unfortunate that you have to be subject to basically brainwashing during work, and hopefully some of that will change. I think just trying to have meaningful one-on-one conversations can help, because what caused so much of the problem was that this became viral, and so there was so much public virtue signaling and online shaming that was happening, which just wouldn't really happen if it was a one-on-one conversation.
I think even if it was a one-on-one, was one-on-one, you'd still have that. So you're not going to get out of it because someone, you maybe your boss is not going to, and then you go up to her and you say some things, and you're not too excited about what she's going to say, and then she goes,
"You wonder, you're dead, bitch. Why are you doing this to this poor guy?"
Right. So then that's the reality. Thanks, Tom. Okay, we're going on. Comedian Owen Benjamin was on here. I mean, he had Cantwell, then he has Owen Benjamin. Not quite the same, but this is the great part. I listened to this, and it just was like, it was awesome to hear, because the way that Owen has changed his minds about a lot of things is evident, and that's just great. This is where we get to see this. So Owen Benjamin, we'll start this one. Actually, no, I've jumped ahead. This is... Let's stop the screen here before we go ahead, because that's not the one I was supposed to have going on. The one I was supposed to have going on is once again, it plays right into the same thing though. Stefan Molyneux comes on there, talks about what is an argument. And, I haven't listened to Stefan in a long time, and this was actually a fantastic, and I miss this Molyneux guy. This is the one I missed. Okay, so what is an argument?
Probably more than ever. So why don't you start off by explaining what, in fact, it is that you mean in this book when you use the term the argument?
Well, a term just popped into my head while we were bringing this topic up, Tom, which is blindfolded butcher. And, being a butcher, whatever your culinary tastes or ethics, being a butcher is a precise and difficult job, something you wouldn't want to do blindfolded. And it seems to me, because of social media, because of the influx of people into higher education, we have a lot of people engaged in social discourse who don't really seem to know what they're doing, which is like a whole bunch of people swarming in, blindfolding themselves, picking up the butcher's chainsaw and going to town. And so public discourse is really degrading to the point where, as you know, like you try and be a non-radical leftist, give a speech at a university, you might get a bike lock to the head. People might throw fake blood at you, and they might pull fire alarms. They might drive cars into people, all of which, of course, do not fall into the category of what we happily would call an argument. And so I wanted to give the world a non-technical, engaging way to understand what an argument is, some of the various different flavors of arguments, and why it's so important. I mean, it's like those old shows, the little commercials, like the PA says, this is your brain on drugs. It's supposed to frighten you into not doing drugs. Hey, kids, don't do drugs. Or you would see some guy with no teeth rooting around through the garbage, and your parents would say, oh, that guy, he tried crystal meth only once. And looking at the alternative is pretty terrifying. Or, the people who don't take care of their teeth or whatever it is, or people who gain too much weight. And so I wanted to show how much fun and how enjoyable and how what great mental exercise a real argument is, and also to give the heaven of argumentation and the hell of whatever argumentation isn't, which tends to be, bullying, unjust ostracism. It tends to be escalating violence, and it tends to be basically a new dark age. So I wanted to give people the lamp to aim towards and the dark to flee in a pretty compact and hopefully entertaining package.
Okay, perfect. We'll just keep moving on with Stefan and talking about the argument stuff. The next one we have here is blame the victim for speech is violence compared with, what did I put here? Argumentation ethics. I don't know if they necessarily do it, but you can make that comparison because we've talked about that. Tom did just a few episodes ago.
Speaker comes to campus, well, that person's arguments really amount to violence, or in the less extreme versions, let's say they provoke violence or intended to provoke violence. So really, by suppressing that speech, we're really acting preemptively in self-defense.
It's a fascinating argument, morally horrifying and creepy as all get up. It's like some chilblain millipede crawling up your spine marrow to even conceive of it. But, my sort of pushback on this would be sort of two major points. The first, of course, I mean, outside of the obvious free speech ones, which have been done to death, but the first would be that the left continually insists that you not blame the victim. The left continually insists that, let's say some guy beats up his wife, and then he says, well, she was disrespecting me, or she didn't obey my order, or the steak wasn't the right temperature, or whatever, right? Or she's going out dressed in too revealing a set of clothes. Well, then you would say, well, I don't care what she did. You can't blame the victim. You can't say, well, this woman that I grabbed her boob was asking for it because she was wearing a low-cut top. You simply do not blame the victim for somebody who was violent. And then I'd love the leftists to try and square this circle. If you don't blame the victim of violence for whatever they did to provoke that violence, because no provocation justifies violence, if a man can't beat up his wife and then claim some ex post facto justification for it, then how on earth do conservative speakers bring on their own violence? That's
okay. So one, if your wife's not making food, anyway, that's I think that's the right argument. Okay, let's keep going here. The last one I will show with Stefan Molyneux is 9 minutes in. What are we saying here? Not an argument. Declarative statements.
Just say not an argument. Go ahead and give me an argument. I don't know when you started doing that, but it is associated with you. What do you mean when you say not an argument?
Well, it's coaching. I mean, if you've ever played sports and ever been coached to a reasonably qualified level, what does your coach say most of all? That's wrong. That's incorrect. I mean, I remember when I was learning how to give a good serve in tennis, a coach who was like, yeah, reach over the top. And if you go to try and improve, I don't play golf, but I know that from people who do, you try and improve your golf swing, you get all this micro-muscular management of the golf pro telling you, oh, don't jump out of your shot, lean into it, shoulders back. Like 95% of what you receive when you're trying to become good at something is negative feedback. And that's good, because being right is very hard and being wrong is very easy. So, of course, whenever you try anything, you're going to be wrong a lot more than right. So basically what I want to do with that phrase is I want to point out when people aren't making arguments. And it's not meant to humiliate. It's not meant to, like if you show up to play tennis with a hockey stick, I'm going to say, not a tennis racket. I mean, sorry, you can play something. You can play sophistry if you want. You can play emotional regurgitation. but you can't play argument, you can't play thought, you can't play philosophy. And so I just want to point out to make the people who are making the arguments, and in many ways, they're doing so in good faith because they've been so misinformed about how to have rational influence in the public sphere. They think that sophistry is philosophy, and they think that philosophy is violence. And so I want to point out to those people, that's not an argument. And of course, I wanted to point out to the audience, to the people who are reading or who are listening or participating in the conversation, that's not an argument. And of course, at some point after using that phrase for some time, I did get a lot of requests to say, okay, Mr. Negative, Mr. Nagy, perhaps you'd like to tell us not what an argument isn't, but what an argument is.
Excellent. And so I will say this as an attorney, you know, when you're going through law school, they kept pounding it into you. That's a declarative statement. You can't make declarative statements, which is, you know, he's guilty or he stole the stuff. Well, okay. Explain that. And so a real cheap way to do that, I mean, there's a bunch of technical ways, but the real cheap way to help yourself in an argument is make that statement and then use the word because and then finish it. So, right, you got to fill in some facts as to why that is the case. That's kind of what he's talking about here, right? So anyway, there you go. That's your free little part on there. Now we're going to get to Owen Benjamin, okay? We are now going to get to Owen Benjamin, comedian. This was episode 1034. He comes on here, and why was Owen Benjamin even being featured on here? And I thought this was fascinating to remember and kind of where we're at right now. So a lot of these things are pertinent, right? They're cyclical, or we found the origin story here of a lot of the problems. Let's go back to it. When was this one? So this Owen Benjamin, go to Tom's website, November 8th, 2017. Okay, listen.
It was very controversial. I said that 3-year-olds shouldn't be allowed to choose gender and then be put on hormone blockers. And I got in a bit of an argument on Twitter with this guy who's I really don't know that much about him, but I guess he's got some sort of power in Hollywood. And he has a son who's now a girl, and he's 6. And they were coming at free speech, him and this guy, John Hodgman, who I thought I was kind of buddies with, but I guess he's kind of getting a little crazy. They were mocking Mel Brooks' comment about how PC is hurting comedy. And I was like, well, you have a transgender child. Like, you're dressing your kid up as the wrong gender. And then we started going back and forth. And I'm like, just answer me yes or no. Are you planning on giving them hormone blockers? Because there's no going back from that. And they're like, well, when the medical professionals, you know, if they think that's the thing to do. And I'm like, you guys are sick people, man. And then everyone started coming at me hard, like tons of blue check mark people. It wasn't just the normal trolls. And I wouldn't back down. And like something that I was talking to Rogan about and that my wife kind of coined, she was like, yeah, this is a hill you can die on. And I'm like, yeah, like I backed down from things that I know aren't, like I backed down from these type of outrages before when I didn't think the stakes were that high where it didn't matter. But this one, I'm like, no, man, if I have to get a job at a gas station, I won't agree that this isn't horrific to do to children. And so I lost, I had a gig that week at University of Connecticut, and they canceled it. And then within 3 weeks, I had no agent, no manager.
Crazy stuff. So just for saying those kind of things. And you know, like, I don't know if things are changing. We can hope so. But it really did put Owen Benjamin on a new path. Okay, let's keep going here with this one. This, once again, it's fantastic. Is he a First Amendment absolutist?
I've seen these, you know, I've seen people say things like hate speech, the most subjective possible thing, you know, hate speech. Like, one person's hate is another person's freedom, you know. It's like, what does that even mean? And
one person's patriot is another's terrorist. I don't know.
I'm a freedom of speech absolutist, where you have to be able to make mistakes in order to figure out what you even believe. And people treat me like this ignorant idiot. And it's like, my dad has his PhD in rhetoric. Like, I was raised by a guy who taught speech. And so, like, that's one reason why I know how important this is, that you can't start these cyber gulags. You know, you can't put people away like that. We have to have a marketplace of ideas and a marketplace of comedy, or else we're done. And they keep trying to do this stuff, but the spirit and will of people to seek out ways of finding what they like and what they believe in is so much more powerful than these authoritarians. Because the authoritarians, in the end of the day, are incredibly weak people who rely on identity politics to have any sense of strength in the world, because they're cowards. So when you stand up to them, they back down like Gollum. You know, it's just like, ugh. And that's why I highly encourage people just to call them out for what they are, and you will just see how quickly they back down. And yes, they do hate us, because we don't hate ourselves, and we have personal autonomy, and we have loving families and all that stuff. It's
Owen Benjamin, firing it away. So the last one, though, we'll take from Owen. I thought this this one, I don't think this is where Owen was really at anymore. Owen with some loving some Ben Shapiro?
Telling somebody, or I was tweeting or something about, I was like, 20 years ago, Ben Shapiro would just be a normal, nerdy conservative. I'm like, and I love Ben Shapiro. He's one of my favorite podcasts. It's like, they've turned people like him into rock stars by being so crazy. Like, I went from being a comedian that would almost be considered hacky, like men and women are different, to being seen as like a free speech activist, but with the same jokes, because I would do jokes about, soap opera music eyes in a girl's head versus the song in a guy's head. I did that for a Comedy Central special, and it was a big joke and people liked it. And then all of a sudden it's now being said that men and women are identical, yet you can be a woman and a man and all this nonsense. Like just logical fallacies where you can't be the same and be trapped in it. Obviously you get it, but like, so now that joke could be seen as like problematic, where it's like, just because I say men and women are different. And so now I have to stand on that hill, and now I have to stand on this other hill where it's like, no, you can't, because once you start agreeing to this nonsense, they won't be able to back down. And that's how it's like an outrage Ponzi scheme where you eventually get to the 3-year-olds and dress them up in dresses and don't let them go through puberty. And that's what gets me vicious. Like I hate people that
vicious. Okay, Owen Benjamin, check that one out. Obviously, great stuff. All of them. All of these are. I mean, not all of them. Anyway, Gareth Porter comes on. The truth about the Vietnam War. I'm very fascinated with this topic. The Vietnam War to me is very interesting. Carrie Baldwin. I don't know if you ever know who she is. She's done a debate beat Walter Block on abortion at the Soho Forum. Matter of fact, at the end, he's just like, "Oh, you've got such good argument." Walter's a nice guy. She just released I think it was like a memoir of her father, who was in the first battle of Loc Ninh in Vietnam. I think it was 1967. And it was fascinating. Walked through he was going through some PTSD stuff later on in his life. So he started to write some stuff down, and it just kind of comes out. And his expression of the hatred, calling him baby killers and all these things from the anti-war, it was fascinating. But how she tied a bow on it at the end, I thought was fantastic. Tom Woods has said some things here, and maybe I'll play some of those clips. I did, I think, on episode 1 of how he talks about the insidiousness of the anti-war left. Her point was these are Marxists. Now think about it. Someone's out there, they're drafted. They're drafted. They have no choice, or they go to Canada, but they're not. So they're drafted, and you come home and you're spit on because these people are calling you baby killers because they're anti-war. They're just the grossest types of people. You can be anti-war, which I totally am, without having to say that someone is drafted specifically is the most disgusting. So anyway, I think that's a development that the right, or the anti-war right at least, is better at. Okay, but Gareth Porter comes on here and talks about, this is episode 1055, Truth About Vietnam War with Gareth
Domino
Porter. Reaction
theory,
to Ken Burns' documentary, which really helped me change some small facets of it. I don't need to get into all that, but anyway.
One country goes communist, then all of Southeast Asia goes communist. And Nixon's retort to everybody who questioned that was always, well, the dominoes believed it.
Right,
what is your response to that whole theory?
Theory.
I'm glad you've asked that question, because it is such a huge shadow, if you will, over the understanding of people of several generations now, of the dynamics, that surrounded the U.S. war in Vietnam. It's a very good question. What about the dominoes? I mean, of course, the domino in chief in regard to this whole question was Lee Kuan Yew and Singapore, because they're the ones who talked about this incessantly. And the reality is that Singapore, was very successful in part because of foreign investment that came in particularly from Japan. And this was true of the rest of the dominoes in Southeast Asia, both during the Vietnam War and particularly later. The Japanese continued to invest in the non-communist governments, not governments, but countries and economies of Southeast Asia. And that capital was instrumental in then bringing about a lot of economic growth in the region. But that had nothing to do with the U.S. intervention in Vietnam, because had the United States chosen to negotiate in 1962, 63, 64, or 65, rather than to intervene militarily, the growth in the region probably would have been even more spectacular.
Interesting. So, I mean, I think, you talk about the Vietnam War, and what they were trying to do to stop everything. And then when it was all said and done and you lost, did it change anything? That's kind of an important aspect. Next one here, JFK killed because he opposed Vietnam in comparison to Johnson. Interesting. Let's see what they says.
That both John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson were very reluctant to go to war. And in some ways, Johnson was even more determined to avoid war than John F. Kennedy, although that's not his reputation historically. But I show in a variety of ways that Johnson really was very much opposed to this. But he was politically afraid that his own advisors would turn against him and essentially go to the press, go to Congress, and blame him for the loss of South Vietnam. And he was deathly afraid of the consequences of that politically. He was not able to withstand the pressure. John F. Kennedy, we're not sure what he would have done, of course, unfortunately, but he did a lot, as I show in my book, to undermine his own administration's policy once he realized that he'd made a big mistake in late 1961 and tried to get the Joint Chiefs of Staff to agree to a 3-year timetable for pulling out all U.S. troops. That was perhaps a kind of wishy-washy approach to it. Instead of saying we are going to pull out, he felt that he needed to get their approval, and that, of course, never happened before he was shot down.
Okay, there you go. So there's a lot. Dude, some of the stuff on the Vietnam War is just super fascinating to me. The ins and outs and the repercussions of what it did to our country too. The hippie movement, the damn hippies. Okay, so we'll keep moving on here because this kind of ties into it here. This is Noam Chomsky, The Good and the Bad with Gene Epstein. Gene, once again, is also one of the most difficult people to get clips for because you ask him a question and he strings a bunch of stuff and he just keeps going and going and going and going. And then at the very, 20 minutes down, he'll answer that question that was so interesting that I wanted to hear about. So you can't just skip. I don't know. It's tough. But here we are. The first clip we're going to get here is Vietnam War criticism by Chomsky.
Called American Power and the New Mandarins. And let me just read the quote that I quoted back to Chomsky in my letter. He wrote
Gene sent a letter to Noam about his influence on him, and Noam Chomsky's influence on Gene, and also about some other things that Noam got wrong. He said that there was no response, but here's Gene to recount the letter.
Following. What grounds are there for supposing that those whose claim to power is based on knowledge and technique will be more benign in their exercise of power than those whose claim is based on wealth or aristocratic origin? On the contrary, one might expect the new Mandarin to be dangerously arrogant, aggressive, and incapable of adjusting to failure as compared to his predecessor, whose claim to power was not diminished by honesty as to the limitations of his knowledge or demonstrable mistakes. Now, this was a blast to my mind, blew my mind, because I was a little bit of that kind of new Mandarin. I was, at that point, getting a PhD in economics, and I had some identification with professors who thought they had a right to run the world. And this whole approach, which was to question the knowledge and credentials of professors who sought power, affected me very much when I began to read Murray Rothbard and understand economics. Affected me very much when I became an Austrian economist. I just want to read one other thing and then turn it back to you, Tom. What blew my mind as well is when Chomsky compared Averell Harriman, the businessman who was a new Mandarin, with Walt Rostow, a professor. Chomsky made the following remarks. As far as Harriman is concerned, the basis for his power is that his father built railroads. No matter what mistakes he makes, he still has a right to power. So he can be quite pragmatic, and he can change his policies, and he can tell you that he was wrong. Walt Rostow can't say that. If he says, I was all wrong, do it the other way around, then what he is saying is there's no reason at all why he should be in power. Now, this was coming from a quasi-socialist like Chomsky. He was actually saying that if there's a forced choice, better to have a scion of business, an aristocratic business like Averell Harriman run the world, because at least he won't be defensive and crazy, than to have Walt Rostow, a professor. And so this was coming from, again, a guy with strong socialist sympathy.
So evidently something Gene thinks that he got right, at least on that part. Okay, we'll keep going here. This one is Kissinger and Noam Chomsky. Probably know this is all, once again, about the war shit.
So at this point, sort of the grand old man of American foreign policy, even though not, of course, according to people like Scott Horton or others who understand what Henry Kissinger really stood for. But Kissinger kept saying that it saddened him that our motives were questioned. he said this even before he became Secretary of State. He was talking about the motives of Johnson. He kept saying, "Do not question our motives." And it was Chomsky who called this a remarkable comment on the part of one whose professional concern is political analysis. That is, analysis of the actions of governments in terms of motives that are unexpressed in official propaganda. No one would be disturbed, Chomsky continued, by an analysis of the political behavior of Russians, French, or Tanzanians, questioning their motives and interpreting their actions in terms of long-range interests, perhaps well concealed behind official rhetoric. But it is an article of faith that American motives are pure and not subject to analysis. So this, again, is this super sophisticated, presumably sophisticated PhD and political scientist Henry Kissinger saying, "Do not question American government's motives." That, again, is something for which pointing that out in the late 1960s was something for which Noam Chomsky deserves a lot of credit.
Okay, and I would actually disagree a little bit, and reason being is, I mean, look, he knows more about Chomsky than I do. However, I got this clip of Noam Chomsky on, let's see if I can find it here. There we go. Chomsky on William F. Buckley Jr.'s Firing Line TV show. I think this was 60. I want to say either 67 or 69, somewhere around there. So you've already got the Cultural Revolution. Now the Great Leap Forward is in progress. With that in mind, let's play it away.
A good deal of repression and certainly not civil liberties of the sort that we're used to.
Chomsky, one of the most libertarian constitutions in the history of the world was written by the Soviet Union.
I'm not talking about constitutions.
My point is, what kind of freedom is experienced by somebody in North Vietnam? The answer is that the freedom is perpetually insecure.
Oh, well, you don't know
for
that.
Reasons, well,
you see,
I know that Ho Chi Minh himself has wept over the occasional necessity to kill 40, 50,000 of his own.
Not the necessity, the occasional fact. But just one moment. What I was talking, very not only sarcastic but also wrong. And you see, it's very important to recognize, if you want to understand what communism means in Southeast Asia, to realize that along with many authoritarian and repressive practices, which I certainly don't condone, there is on the side a great deal of democratization. There's been a liberation of energies and involvement.
Utter nonsense, if I may say so.
I don't think you're right.
After all, the great paradigm of Red China, in which the AFL-CIO itself concedes to something in the neighborhood of 20 million victims on that particular. I'm quoting them. Perhaps I didn't ask you whether that was correct.
The AFL-CIO
they did have a commission out there.
No one has claimed the million people killed through Chinese communist purges. Absolutely no one. Well, no one serious, at least.
It was published in the New Leader.
Which the New Leader, yes, of course, the New Leader might. I mean, but I'm talking about
CIA plant.
Well, I said no one serious has. Take a look at the China Journal. Take a look at China.
I consider this serious.
You see, I think you're missing the point, really, and I think it's an important point. See, I think in looking at China, one has to recognize a great deal of repressive practice, a great deal of authoritarianism, and one also has to recognize a great deal of spontaneous democratic structure of a sort which never existed in Asia before, and if you want to know the truth, to some extent doesn't even exist in our society. Now, these things exist side by side.
If you read A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisov.
Okay, I laugh because it seems preposterous to me. No one's claiming. Look, the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward actually took first, and that was 50 million, they say, starvation, and then the Cultural Revolution, then when your Mao was doing his purges, which was multiple millions as well, both just disturbing, right, on every end, and Chomsky is just laughing it outright, saying it's bullshit. So he's got some problems, but how about him on economics? So Gene obviously knows his economics. I think this is where the bad might be coming in. Well, a lot of Chomsky's bad.
That he documented over and over again about the brainwashing that kids get in school. I mean, because he had two kids who were going to public schools, and he would quote from the textbooks that they were given to read, and the distorted view of America. Of course, the same idea that American foreign policy is run by philosopher kings who occasionally make mistakes, but do not question their motives. All of the rest of it, and yet he came out for government-run schools.
Yeah, because he's a kind of an inconsistent prick. So we'll keep going. I'm just not a fan of Chomsky. I know there's a lot of good things people could say, oh, look, we could learn from him. Yeah, but once again, you got to start using these people instead of them using us. Okay, use them for our things. That's fine, but then stop glorifying them. Just take some of their points, or hey, this person's for what we're doing here, and then we move on, or maybe discard them. Let's keep going here. His commie blind spot.
Chomsky, about 10 years ago, wrote that the idea that the unraveling of the Soviet Union is in any way a proof that socialism has a problem. He said, he says it's a big distortion. He said, you should compare the Soviet Union, he said, with Brazil. Is what he said. He said, they didn't do, compared to Brazil, they didn't do that badly. You can't compare the Soviet Union with the West because they're just a lot richer. I wrote him actually an email at that point. We were emailing. Chomsky's correspondence, by the way, is another great story in itself. I have 20 letters from him, and I thought, my God, my letters must really interest.
Okay, once again, that's Gene there. I just kind of want to hear the story, Gene, and you got to divert. By the way, which is fantastic for the show itself, and also great for getting clips. Last one here is reminds me of Tom comparing. Okay, I don't know what this one's about.
When I said, dear Noam Chomsky, you said we should compare the Soviet Union with Brazil. I said, how about the two controlled experiments that we've been handed? East Germany versus West Germany, North Korea versus South Korea. And now, don't they give us a more or less an understanding of what happens when you have a more or less market economy in West Germany versus the communist economy in East Germany, North Korea versus South Korea, similar analogy, sort of a controlled experiment. And he wrote me back a very polite letter, but he said, actually, your analogies are worthless. He didn't elaborate. I'm embarrassed even to report that. He said, your analogies are worthless. He said something about how North Korea was isolated. East Germany was too much under the thumb of them. So you can always make excuses. So probably this is a guy we're never going to convince him to like capitalism. I mean, I guess we have a challenge. Can we bring Jeremy Scale around?
Okay, I don't know what that last one is. Okay, so there you go. We're not going to bring him around. Okay, well, that's good to know. The last one, not the last one. The next one we're doing here is we're just going to play a little potpourri. Well, that's what it's called. Episode 1091 potpourri with Dave Smith, Ben Shapiro attacks on Paul, plus Trump, immigration, and more. Tom's appearance on Dave's show. I don't know, but anyway. So this one is Tom and Dave play a Shapiro clip and then respond as I watch and review it. That's just kind of so we'll do a one clip from this show, which is fantastic.
See if you can notice the inconsistencies. So here's Ben Shapiro taking a question from a student.
Hello, Ben. My name is Joe. I'm holding my phone because I'm recording for my dad. He's a big fan, so he says hi.
Oh, tell him I say hi.
Yeah.
Hey, Dad. How's it going?
So I have two pretty serious points to address. In 2016, you had put out a list of people that you thought were characterized as the alt-right, and one of them happened to be a philosopher who I hold pretty highly, Ron Paul. And I was kind of curious why you put Ron Paul on that list, just because Ron Paul was one of the people that did inspire me to conservatism.
Right, so Ron Paul's libertarian views on government, I'm largely in agreement with, and that's not what makes him alt-right on that list. What made him alt-right on that list was a sense of identity politics that amounted to him engaging in relatively open anti-Semitism, unfortunately. Ron Paul wrote for an anti-Semitic newsletter in Texas. He wrote a book in which he equated anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism and then basically said that he was anti-Zionist. He's been involved with soft-pedaling members of the alt-right for a long time. I think that the idea of him as a pure alt-right figure might be a bit of an exaggeration. Maybe you want to say that he is friendly to the alt-right. At least a lot on the alt-right are friendly to him. But the relationship in terms of foreign policy, I would say he's a paleocon who verges on alt-right. Not everybody who's paleo, maybe you're right. Maybe the idea is that he's not fully alt-right because he doesn't espouse a white supremacist view that says that white people are superior to other people, but he is fully in line with an anti-Semitic view that views Israel as the font of all evil in the Western world, and he has given aid and comfort to a lot of folks on the alt-right. So I think that's probably a fair criticism.
Okay. All right, Tom. So you heard the question. First off, let me just say that it did kind of warm my heart that a college student stood up and said, here's a philosopher who I hold in high regard, who you put on this alt-right list. So I did like that. But what's your response to Ben Shapiro?
Well, it's interesting that Shapiro more or less concedes that probably the kid has a fair point.
Yeah.
Which is more than most people would say. They would just double down. But he says that Ron Paul supports identity politics. And I thought, the same Ron Paul, you sure? The same grandfatherly guy we saw who just constantly avoided that sort of thing all the time? The same guy who, before every group he was invited to, he just talked about individual rights. You've probably heard me say this before, but he was invited to an Arab American dinner. Mm-hmm. And they said, Dr. Paul, have you written a special speech for our group? And he says, no, it's the same speech I give everywhere. That's the exact opposite of identity politics, right? Yeah. The exact opposite. I give the same speech to every group. I don't care what your identity is. Then it was open anti-Semitism. Well, open. But open anti-Semitism, like what was he saying? Jews are terrible people? I mean, did you ever hear Ron Paul say something like that? That would be open anti-Semitism. So then it turned out he wrote for an anti-Semitic newsletter. Now, look, I've heard this one sort of thing a million times. First of all, did they just reprint an article of his, a speech or something? I don't know. Let me look. Highly, highly unlikely. I basically don't believe that. But he's upset that Ron Paul made a distinction between anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist, that you can be anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic. Well, obviously you can. Zionism just has to do with should the Jewish people have a national home in Palestine, because that's what Zionism eventually became. Initially, Zionism was not committed necessarily to Palestine as the home for the Jewish people, but eventually that's what it became. And early on, like if you look at the late 19th century, the most ferocious opponents of Zionism were religiously observant Jews, because they viewed it as hubris, that God would miraculously restore the Jewish people at a time of his choosing. It's not like God is waiting for human effort, like, let's get off our rear ends and give God a little push here. That was viewed as not how history was supposed to go. So there were plenty of anti-Zionist Jews right around the time Zionism was being started. So that whole thing. And then he says, well, maybe he's not friendly to the alt-right, but the alt-right is friendly to him. Well, again, what does that mean? So I'm responsible for the views of people who happen to like what I have to say. John Wayne Gacy voted for Jimmy Carter. I don't blame Carter for that. And likewise, I bet there are people who like Ben Shapiro, who he probably would not want to invite to his home for dinner. I bet there are a lot of boorish people who have very, very unfashionable views who happen to like Ben Shapiro. But I wouldn't say that's the reason we shun Ben Shapiro. I would say smearing people like this would be a much better reason.
There you go. And that's the only clip we're going to play. But I just thought it was a great defense, and you put it out there. And it also, look, Ben Shapiro, I know Owen Benjamin likes him, but there can definitely be some problems. And once again, why go to the lengths of almost out of context? That's kind of the whole thing that happened with Tom Woods and the Cantwell thing, right? Okay. Moving on. This is Lou Rockwell. You can't keep going on without throwing some Lou Rockwell, episode 1107, Standing On Against the Tide, the origin of LouRockwell.com. Take it away, Lou.
It's worth hearing about. And so I think people are just curious about the story of LouRockwell.com. And are we close to the 20th year?
We are. We're in the 19th year, and so yes, one more year. And it all began when Clinton was bombing Serbia. I had a big Rolodex, and I started to send out things to people's email addresses against the war that Clinton was running, and it got a good response from people, and it led me to think, well, really, I should have a website about this sort of thing. And so I started the website, and I must say it got pretty quick positive response from people. Of course, I got hate mail, and Jonah Goldberg didn't like it, and other things that really struck in my heart. But I think there was a place for it, and I should give credit to Drudge, because I was inspired by his old-fashioned, no change look to his site to design mine, and it's gotten a good response. And so yes, it's 19 years old, and I hear from a lot of young people, not Jordan Peterson but a lot of young people who tell me they started reading it in high school, and it had a good effect on their lives. So they felt.
Yeah.
So it's been a lot of fun. I look forward to doing it every day, and I enjoy the emails I get. And I don't get that many hate mails anymore, which I don't know whether to feel bad about that or good about it. But there are a lot of positive, a lot of people who like it of all ages, but especially young people. And I'm glad I think it's had a good effect. It's helped bring maybe Murray Rothbard to more people's attention. Not that he wasn't already very famous in libertarianism and otherwise. So I must say it's been a huge amount of fun. And I'm very glad that it happened, and I'm glad it's still going.
I just must say, I remember hearing about Lou Rockwell from the Rush Limbaugh on his show. He was reading some of his stuff. This was, in the 90s, late 90s. So anyway, that just kind of interesting how things come full circle, how I didn't know much about him, kind of heard about him, and then gravitated this way. That's all we're going to show that one. The next one, or actually, no, this is Tom's intro to Rothbard.
Looking ahead, what would you like to see the Mises Institute do in the future?
I'm just going to reminisce for a moment about 25 years ago when you were at Claremont, and I had talked to Murray Rothbard about the fact that you wanted to speak to him and were very much worth speaking to. And I said, Murray, he's what you've always wanted. He's a top historian who knows economics. And Murray said, what? So I remember introducing the two of you in sort of the central area of the Claremont campus, and I left you two talking. And more than an hour later, I came back by there, and you're still both of you just standing close to each other, just talking. And that was so heartwarming. And I thought this is a very, very good development for libertarianism and correct history and correct economics and so forth, as of course, indeed, it turned out to be. So I think the Institute has 35 years now. I think we've had a very good effect. I know I won't mention who it was, but there's a so-called libertarian economist who is not a fan of the Institute. And he keeps saying, look, we can't use the words Austrian economics anymore because if you put that into Google, the Mises Institute comes up rather.
Okay, I don't know who that one is. Okay, it's probably someone from Cato. All right. Well, moving on. This one is episode 1148. Once there, you just learned so many things about all these shows that you take in. The totalitarian Jean-Jacques Rousseau of the French Revolution, and who was the Professor Gerard Casey was on this one. This first one, social contract.
When you talk about the social contract, there are a number of ideas in there that need to be explained, the general will perhaps chief among them. But before getting to those, try and explain what is the difference between the social contract, so-called, as Rousseau understands it, and other forms of social contract thinking that we see in thinkers who preceded him.
Yeah, that's a really very good question. I wish I had a sort of snappy answer to that one. I don't. One thing I think at least is clear, that sometimes when people talk about social contract theory, there are two broad ways of understanding this. One is that somehow people got together at a particular time in the past, sat down and had an agreement, which then is the source of the order, political order from then on. Rousseau doesn't think that, right? He doesn't think whatever the social contract is for Rousseau, it's not an historical event, right? Really, the social contract for him, and I think I'm correct in saying this, but again, I have to make the point that it's really difficult to be certain about anything in Rousseau. I think I'm correct in saying that for him, the social contract is to be understood, as it were, sort of counterfactually. When we look at society in the way in which it is organized right now, we, as it were, by participating and being a member of society, we have, as it were, virtually contracted, even though we actually have never sat down and have never been asked and have never signed a piece of paper. So it's something like that. If we were to think of it in modern terms, it would be something like you would get in the writings of, say, of John Rawls, where, so behind a veil of ignorance, people would choose, if you like, an order in which no one would be massively advantaged and no one would be massively disadvantaged. Of course, we never find ourselves behind a veil of ignorance. This is a sort of hypothetical construction. So to that extent, Rousseau's social contract, the idea of contract here, is really, I think, a hypothetical entity rather than an actual entity.
There you go. Rousseau, horrible person. Just throwing that out there. Okay, last, we'll show another clip here. We're just cruising along here. False consciousness.
Us socially and politically, and that's the whole idea of false consciousness. And of course, I mean, this notion of false consciousness has had a long innings, and it comes up in various ways. But the basic idea is in Rousseau. Remember, the people weren't capable of being persuaded; they weren't capable of responding to reason. And in that case, you're treating individuals as if they were children. Now, it's perfectly appropriate to treat children as if they're children, but not adults. And so the idea behind false consciousness is that somehow I or my group, we are the enlightened ones, okay, and we know what's really good for you. You, on the other hand, don't. And therefore, even though you express your desires for A, B, or C, we have to tell you, unfortunately, that A, B, and C won't really make you happy, aren't for your good, and therefore you are prey to false consciousness, but we somehow magically and mysteriously are not. Now,
there you go. Check that one out. Some stuff about Rousseau and the philosophy behind it. All right, we're just cruising along. This one is the Bitcoin Standard. My favorite guy, Safadine Amus, comes on. I listened to multiple. Look. So he and I have some personal beefs. And Tom interviews him, and I was listening because I'm like, I know on Jeff Deist he was wrong about his own book, and then you read the book, and that's even more wrong. But am I going to, just because I have a problem and he told me to go fuck myself in the DMs? And I wrote a Substack calling him out. Is it going to limit me from playing a clip? No, we're going to still play a clip from him. So here we are, episode 1171, the Bitcoin Standard, decentralized alternative to banking. This one is Bitcoin used for victimless crimes.
Can be used for victimless crimes, but it would be extremely stupid to use it for things that involve actual victims. And, obviously as a libertarian, I don't think there is such a thing as a victimless crime. But yes, Bitcoin has been used a lot for people buying drugs online or things like that. But, if you're going to commit a crime and you're going to pay somebody to commit that crime, the last thing you want is to have a permanent record distributed over thousands of people listing that transaction. You'll never know what kind of technology emerges over time that can identify who this address belongs to or who that address belongs to, and then somebody will be able to link them to one another, and then 5 years later somebody is able to find out that you were the one who committed the crime. So generally, I always say to all the criminals, stick to the international criminal currency of choice, the US dollar, because it's far better for all criminal needs to just use cash bills than to try and use Bitcoin, which leaves a permanent record. Lots of people have used it, but people forget that a lot of the criminals that have gotten caught using Bitcoin were specifically caught because of using Bitcoin. And I think this meme that has spread around of Bitcoin as being good for dark currency and for drugs, it's extremely, extremely misguided, and it's extremely dangerous because a lot of people have ruined their lives because they got this idea that Bitcoin is safe, anonymous, dark digital currency on the internet. It isn't. It leaves a record permanently distributed over thousands of computers all over the world. Definitely not what you want to do if you're committing a crime. Now, granted, there are ways of hiding your tracks, but they're extremely difficult because there are also ways of trying to track you down. So I would definitely not recommend it be used for crime. And I think over time, what has happened, particularly over the last 2-3
Okay, but when they're making outlawing everything, then you've got a problem. So is he for Bitcoin? Is he not? I mean, I just read about there was actually I saw it on Anarchy Against Friends. Listen to it. Jason Booth talking about a gun shop in I think Federal Way, Washington, by Olympia, Seattle, and they had passed a 10-round capacity mags. Anything over that was outlawed, and it was kind of like a sanctuary city where the sheriff's like, look, that we're not enforcing it, and 2, it's unconstitutional. So go ahead. So this guy sells 2,600 magazines, and they're now the AG is filing suit against them under Privacy Protection, Consumer Protection Act. So the fine is $7,500 per incident, either sold or even put on sale. So right now it's about 20 million. I think it's ridiculous. So the point is they then make criminal just your regular day-to-day activity, Safadine. So maybe you should use cash then? I don't know. Read the Bitcoin Standard either way, people. It'll probably serve you, or a different book that's on Bitcoin. That might be the better way to go. Okay. Or are there objective moral truths? This is a gentleman that I do have a lot of respect for, Michael Humer, not Shermer. I respect Shermer too, even though we kind of ditched him. Dave Smith and I did. The premise of ethical intuitionism. Take it away, Michael.
Well, so there are a couple of issues. A major issue in metaethics is objective values. Are there any? And so the intuitionist view is yes. What that means is there are facts about what's right and wrong or good and bad that are independent of observers' attitudes. So it's wrong to torture babies, and that's wrong even if you like it, or even if you think that it's good, or regardless of how you feel about it, also regardless of how society feels about it or whatever. So if society adopts conventions according to which we torture babies, then society will just be wrong. Another part of ethical intuitionism is about our knowledge of ethical truths, which is where the idea gets its name. It's that our knowledge of ethical truths ultimately derives from something called ethical intuition, which is a sort of direct intellectual insight. I.e., you think about an ethical question and it will just seem to you a certain way. And it's on the basis of that you have a justified belief in the absence of any grounds for doubt. That's a short version of the theory.
So I'm fascinated with this kind of thing because you see Michael Knowles as an example. He just keeps saying, oh, we're going to just enforce what's right. But that's his version. And I know I probably don't agree with it. It's also what I wouldn't agree with Brad Palumbo on. But what is that? And so it sounds like humor is kind of breaking down some issues here. How's it used?
How do you use ethical intuitionism as a way of refuting a nihilist, for example?
Well, so the main thing that I say is, suppose somebody has this argument that there are no values, right? Nothing is good or bad, nothing is right or wrong. They must have some reason for believing that. So you could look at the premises of their argument, and then you should ask yourself if those premises are more or less plausible than the premise that, for example, it's wrong to torture babies for the fun of it. Unless they have some starting assumption that's more obvious to you than the wrongness of torturing babies for fun, their argument can't succeed, right? Because it couldn't be rational for you to reject something that's more obvious based on something that's less obvious. For almost everyone, there are some ethical truths that are more obvious than the philosophical premises that are used to support nihilism, right? So philosophers will give premises like a belief about an objective fact could never be motivating, and moral beliefs are motivating. Therefore, moral beliefs are not beliefs about objective facts, right? But is it as obvious that both of those two premises are true as that you shouldn't torture babies for fun? Right? So almost like any normal person would find, it's more obvious that you shouldn't torture babies.
Okay, we're just going to stop. Too much baby torture. I think that's just the obvious way to bring in the most absurd to understand what he's actually talking about. Okay, and the last one we're going to play with humor here is the problem with intuitions. Moral.
This is what an opponent might say, is that we can never check whether an ethical intuition is correct without relying on intuition. In contrast, empirical beliefs can often be checked by other means. If I doubt whether the table I see is real, I can test this by trying to touch it, by asking other people if they also see it, or trying to put a glass on it. Now, how do you respond to that?
Right, yeah. Well, so whether you can check something or not sort of depends upon what we're counting as the allowed ways of checking. So if the question is, can we check observation? You can only check observation by using other observations. And similarly, if the question is, can you check intuition? You can only check intuitions by using other intuitions. So like if the skeptic is saying, oh, we have to be able to verify the reliability of an intuition without using any other intuitions at all, that's probably impossible. But similarly, and the same skeptic might say, oh, you have to be able to check observations without using any other observations at all, which is also impossible. Also, by the way, it's impossible to check on your memory without using memory. It's impossible to check on reasoning without using reasoning. So, but it is possible to check on one observation using other observations. And it is also possible to check on one intuition while using other intuitions. Right? That is, you can see if the intuitive judgments that you have about different cases fit together.
Folks, just a quick message before we go on. You know how little patience I have.
Sorry about that. Tom Woods. There you go. Talking with humor. And then throwing in an ad. But that brings us to, we're doing a whole review show. So it's not all just clips we're playing, because remember, at the end, we're going to rate and review Tom's show in multiple categories. One is his ability to insert ads. There you go. You just got to see a prime example of that one. Just 2 more episodes left for this one. This is episode 1263, Reasons Matt Welch on Libertarianism, Foreign Policy, Journalism, and Michael Malice. Remember, Malice brought in Tom Woods and Matt Welch onto his show. That's how I started episode 1 with this, to kind of give you this understanding. And now Tom had Welch on with him. And then Welch was on Tom's show. Tom was on Welch's show. Anyway, Interview Magazine.
Straight out. What's your favorite thing about Michael Malice?
You know what? He's such a malevolent little beast and a troll of high standing, an anarchist, and all of this. I've come up with so many adjectives. Back when we used to have the Independents on Fox Business Network, he was a frequent guest, and I would do pre-writes at Reason. But no, it is that he's actually, underneath all of it, a sweet and loyal guy, which I'm sure he would hate the sweet part, but he's a very loyal person. For all of the very weird things about Michael Malice, he's got a good heart and he's loyal.
I'm so glad you said that, because it's funny that I would have said exactly the same thing. Good-hearted and loyal. He stands by his friends. I mean, he has fun with people, and sometimes he can really rake people over the coals. But if you're his friend, he won't let anybody do that to you. He's a good guy. He's been.
That's something that I would hope people would say about me and my wife. Well, for each other, obviously. But then for your friends as well. Loyalty seems to be, I think that goes above and beyond. And by the way, that means sometimes, just give you some words of advice here, sometimes that means telling them the truth, like they're a piece of shit or something. Not your wife, but your friends. Maybe not your friends. I don't know. Going to the next one. Journalism without journalism school? Matt Welch?
Yeah. All right, so you bypassed traditional journalism school and instead just went out and did journalism.
Yes. What's particularly great about the daily nexus of UC Santa Barbara, especially at that time, although it still has some goodness. 1, it was daily, or 5 days a week. 2, it was not tethered even a little teeny tiny bit to any single, not just journalism program, but journalism class. The whole thing, it was self-made and self-perpetuated by the students. I remember walking through there as an 18-year-old, scared out of my mind, because it was such a good paper and these people were strange. And back then it was the nickname the commie rag, affectionately there. It was definitely left of center. And I come in, dribbling basketballs and dressing like Axl Rose, and I had much more of a frat vibe than they were used to. But I would walk in, and the training editor at the time had written this like 90-page book for new employees called Nexistentialism, obviously. But it was an incredible journalism primer, and it's just what they did. They saw their mission as, let's perpetuate this great journalistic tradition by ourselves. There is no adult in the room telling us what we can and cannot do. Let's take that responsibility seriously, even if we don't take ourselves seriously. Incredible ethic. Really, it changed so many lives of people I know. So many great journalists and people have come through there. And it also bred a very entrepreneurial spirit, as you can well imagine. And it's no accident that myself and 4 of my colleagues from there started a newspaper in Prague and went on to start lots of different media companies and websites and other things based out of there. So yeah, it was very self-created. Once I discovered that, it was really hard to sit in a class because.
Oh, there you go, Matt Welch. Last one we're going to play with Matt Welch is on his biggest regret yet, at least foreign policy or reporting or whatnot. What do you think it is?
Is that, that led me to the place where I didn't identify, and this is my biggest regret in terms of thinking about policy and writing and talking about it. I never supported the Iraq War, but I didn't oppose it from the beginning, from the get-go, as like, what the hell are we even thinking about? And I totally regret that, because I should have known that. Part of the reason why I didn't know that is because I had this feeling like, well, America has to be this kind of last backstop of international order. When the really, really bad guy does the really, really bad thing, we need someone there. I no longer think that way. So long story is to say, yes, it influenced my foreign policy being there into a more interventionist direction. And since then, and following through the logic of the way that I thought about things then, it has influenced me in the opposite direction since. And now I'm floating into this kind of unhappy ether that nonetheless defaults on the side of we need to roll back our far-flung sole responsibility for the world's affairs, that is the root of a whole bunch of dysfunction, not only in America, not only on the people on the receiving end of our munitions, but also in the rest of the world in terms of them taking responsibility for their own affairs. And I felt that way pretty strongly since 2003, let's say.
Wow. So sometimes it's... Is he consistent with this with the Ukraine war? I think for the most part, I did remember, and I should have pulled the clip from it. He was talking about the Ukraine war and the Russians, and he starts going off from the Russians themselves about how they're just awful, awful, evil people. And they try to, this is on the fifth column, try to kind of correct him, and he just keeps going. Now, fifth column, I had sent something over to Malice. He wrote the white pill, and I said, hey, Michael Moynihan should interview you. That'd be great. I did that on Twitter. Moynihan responded back because someone's like, "Oh, they hate each other," and he's like, "No, I don't hate him." And then I said something like that to Malice on one of his live streams, and he responded. He's like, "Oh, that would be interesting. I'd be up for it." He goes, "I think I'm boycotted on the Fifth Column podcast. I'm not allowed to go on there." And he's like, "I have no, Moynihan and I have had conversation, and I just think." Malice wrote this book. There's no one contemporary right now that I think is better than a lot of these issues of the Cold War or whatnot than Michael Moynihan. The two Michaels should sit down and hash this out. Tom Woods, if somehow, let's say Tom Woods is actually watching this and through this part, let's make it happen. Let's do it. Okay, last one episode we're going to show for day, was it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? Day 5 here. Episode 1332, Should Libertarians Support Secession? Brian McClanahan comes in with the hammer because we're going to feature 3 clips for this one. Cato article against the South and secession. Let's go.
There is a strain of libertarian contrarianism. So right away by word 7, it's my opponents can't possibly be sincere. They're just cranks who like to be on the other side of everything.
Yeah, that's right. Just contrary people. They're just,
right.
You're right. It's
now, by the way, that's not to say I haven't met some people like that in the libertarian world. Let's face it. But all right. He says that holds that the Confederate States of America were within their, quote, rights, unquote, to secede from the Union. Such contrarianism on this particular topic is detrimental to the larger cause of liberty because the logic of this argument relies upon relinquishing individual rights to the whim of the state. Indeed, as there is no legal or moral justification for supporting the Confederacy in the Civil War, it is impossible that there could be a libertarian one. Now, the second paragraph. The legal argument against secession is straightforward. Beyond the simple fact that most countries don't provide for their own dissolution at the outset, the Constitution is not silent on the use of force by the federal government. Article 1, Section 8 clearly grants Congress the power to put down insurrections, as the South was well aware. As recently as 1859, that power had been used by then Union Colonel Robert E. Lee to put down John Brown's mindless and bloody raid on Harper's Ferry. Okay. Oh, gosh, Brian, there are more paragraphs even after these, but why don't
There's 11 pages of this. 11 pages.
All right. So, all right. So how do you... First of all, do you want to start with the first paragraph? What do you think?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, a couple of things I underlined here. The whim of the state, individual rights to the whim of the state. It's a very strange view of what happened in the South because, and I run into this a lot. People will say, well, the state seceded, but the way this happened, and people don't often realize this, they think, well, maybe the legislature called a session. These states seceded through popularly elected conventions. So they called a convention of the people of the state. So the people of the state seceded. And that's the foundation of American government. And we go back and we talk about what are the states. Well, the founding generation would have said that they're the people of the states. I mean, you look at how the Constitution was ratified. It was ratified in convention of the states. Now, I know Marshall would say, well, that was only because it was convenient. Otherwise, it was the whole people. We can get into all that argument all day long. But the fact is the people of the states seceded. So it wasn't the whim of the state. This was, in some cases, unanimous that these conventions left the Union. So
yeah, but on the other hand, don't people say these conventions were just dominated by big planters and stuff like that?
Well, they do say that. In some cases, you do have a large number of these large planters, but not everyone there was a large planter, and certainly even in some cases, there was some just debate about secession, and it still were the majorities in these conventions were larger than that which would have supported independence in 1776. So I don't buy the argument that there were some large planters there, they're slave owners. Yeah, that's a granted that happened. But the fact is, we still have to look at who was driving these things out. And would that have been any different if they were in the United States? These large planters dominated the congressional delegations, the state governments. It didn't really matter. So what are they supposed to do? We'll say, you know what, you large planters, you can't vote. We're just going to let these people vote because posterity will look back and say, well, just the large planters drove us out of the Union.
Okay, there you go. So that's issue one. Okay, let's keep going on here because I got two more clips. Brian McClanahan, this one is the legality for secession. I mean, as an attorney myself, I'm listening up. Let's go.
When you look at this, and there's two arguments against secession. One, Article 1, Section 8 doesn't say that a state can leave the Union. And two, Article 1, Section 10 says that states can't form confederacies, right? So Article 1, Section 10 is where the power is denied to the states. Article 1, Section 8 are the powers granted to the general government. But when you say Article 1, Section 8, there's no power in the Constitution to leave the Union, well, of course not. Because all the powers that weren't listed there were reserved to the states. So if they don't say we can't secede in Article 1, Section 10, they can. This was how the Constitution was sold across the board to the people who ratified it in the convention. So this argument that, well, because it doesn't say you can't secede doesn't mean it means you can't do it. No, that's the complete, you don't even understand ratification. You don't understand original intent. You don't understand how this process worked. So clearly he doesn't know this. And I don't fault him for that because this is one thing that people often use. Well, it doesn't say you can secede, so you can't secede. The fact that it doesn't say that they can or can't secede means that they could. And in fact, you had 3 states said we're going to have resumption clauses as a conditional ratification, Virginia, New York. And so we're going to make sure that if the general government abuses its powers, we're out of here. I mean, we're going to leave this union. Now, we can talk about these resumption clauses were ultimately rejected, but still people recognize, and James Wilson sold the Constitution on the fact in the State House Yard speech that, look, it doesn't say we can do it. We can't do it. Everything else is left to the states. And so if it doesn't deny the states the power of seceding, leaving the union, then the states can leave the union.
Oh, yeah. Okay, there you go. There's nothing against it. Now, obviously, there's a war that said that's not the case. So what about this war, the Civil War? Is it the war for independence? Is it war for retaining slavery or independence? What say you?
Let's look at where he says, as an aside, that most soldiers of the Confederacy didn't have slaves or think they were fighting to preserve slavery is non sequitur. He says the argument against the South's actions in the Civil War has nothing to do with the motivations of its soldiers. But it is morally relevant in whether you think the North is justified in burning cities down and making kids eat rats for dinner. Right. That is relevant, given that those kids and those families and most of those men, as we know from their diaries and letters, certainly were not fighting for slavery. It would be morally relevant as to whether. So in other words, if he's saying it's only the political elites who are to blame, okay, then at the very least, you would have to agree morally that a far preferable outcome would be a duel with the political elites of the South. Okay, if that's what you're really unhappy about, do that, and then you'll be on our side for 99% of the issue, which is leave these people out of it.
Right. Well, the funny thing about that, and you look at the common soldier and what they said. In fact, James McPherson. James McPherson is no one who was, but he wrote a book, an interesting book for Cause and Comrades. And his statement, I'm paraphrasing, but it's essentially this: the Southern soldiers were almost to a man fighting against slavery, their own enslavement. And they thought that they were being enslaved by the general government. So they're fighting against it. And one of the things as well, you're right, when you get to the point, going in and invading the South and burning cities and the total war tactics, even though some historians now are saying that wasn't really total war, that was not total war at all. Total war is something else. This was just ensuring that you could knock out the infrastructure of the South so that they couldn't use it to defend themselves. Well, what is total war then? And if you're burning cities and taking stuff from people and going in and destroying property, well, what is that? But regardless,
it's a mostly peaceful protest. Hello.
Things that's often, maybe this piece was again written because this argument now has been much more circulated, but the original 13th Amendment that is often called the Corwin Amendment, but there's a book by Daniel Cross, again not a neo-Confederate quote unquote historian, but Daniel Cross. It's Lincoln and the Politics of Slavery, where he says this was actually Lincoln's amendment, and people that don't know, the Corwin Amendment, or what Cross says is Lincoln's amendment, would have made slavery permanent in the southern states. It couldn't have been abolished. The United States government couldn't abolish slavery, and the South still sought independence. So if they were really just saying, look, this is all about slavery, it's the only thing we're doing, that would have protected slavery forever. And there were Southerners who said, look, slavery is better protected in the Union than out. If we lose, slavery's gone. I mean, they really thought that would happen. So we need to stay in the Union. because if we're really concerned about slavery, but independence was a higher goal than anything else. And the fact that the South, even at the end of the war, was talking about abolishing slavery shows you that independence was more important to them than the institution itself.
There you go. Okay. Brian McClanahan finishing us off. Episode 1332. Next week, or tomorrow, we're going to start doing episodes 1381 through 1840. Murray Polner, feminism, Vince Vaughn, anti-libertarian character assassinations, and let's smash them. That's what we like to hear. Hard cases, coronavirus. We're getting into the coronavirus stuff, people. Harvard Medical School, Martin Kulldorff, lockdown hysteria, COVID charts, Christianity in the state, the forgotten old right, fiat money. That was a rough one to take. Intellectual property, Mao's mass murder. Death of journalism, Clint Russell, fake conspiracies. This is all coming up, and it's what we're gonna see. So there you go. 4 or 5 days down of the Tom Woods Show. Thank you, everybody. If you've hung around, there's a little bit longer one. I'm not cutting this one up, but I'm gonna maybe take a few clips out in the next ones. We're gonna do those episodes, and then what we're going to do. Then we're going to rate and review the Tom Woods Show. Thank you, everybody. Tyler Yonke, Libertarian Podcast Review. Thank you.
Okay, I'm leaving now. Bye, guys.
But she's back.
And now.
Chick-fil-A is completely overrated. It's not that good. I prefer Zaxby's. I prefer Popeyes.
Takes a tough man to make a tender forecast, Nick. I guess that's me. Keep fucking that chicken.
Should I vote for Dick Cheney on the Libertarian Party? Do I have an obligation to vote for Dick Cheney?
I would say so.
Yes.
Did it work for those people?
No, it never does. I mean, these people somehow delude themselves into thinking it might, but it might work for us.
That one dude was like, not a podcast, I can't find it anywhere, and they don't have video.
Oh, yeah, Peter Janke, yeah.
Yeah, I blocked him.
I'll do it. If he unblocks me, I'll...
He'll buy your shirt if you unblock him, Bert.
He's a wigger.
Yeah, nothing cooler than a 49-year-old wigger. I just started live streaming. Cut me some slack. I'm pretty high tech for a boomer. But anyways,
boomer.